When people talk about controlling their mind, they usually imagine some kind of internal tug of war. Willpower versus weakness. Logic versus emotions. And while that metaphor has its place, the reality is much more specific and much more scientific, because your brain isn't just one thing. It's a collection of systems working at different speeds with different priorities, often pulling you in opposite directions. At the center of that dynamic is a fundamental misunderstanding most people have. They think their conscious mind is calling the shots. But in truth, over 90% of what you think, feel, and do is governed by subconscious processes, reflexive pathways that evolved to keep you alive before long you ever had a rational thoughts. So the first step toward controlling your mind is to understand this. Your conscious thought is not the operator. It's the newest intern in the building. The real operators live deep inside your brain. Specifically, in the limbic system. The limbic system includes structures like the amygdala, which handles fear and emotional reactivity, and the hypothalamus, which regulates your stress response, hunger, and body temperature. These areas are ancient. They're lightning fast, and they don't wait for permission. If you've ever said something in the heat of the moment and regretted it, or felt hijacked by anxiety in a situation that didn't logically warrant it, that was your limbic system firing ahead of your prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that sits just behind your forehead. It's responsible for logical reasoning, executive functions, planning, impulse control, everything we associate with rationality. But here's the issue: it's slower, it's deliberate. And under stress, it can easily be shut down. In other words, if you don't train it to stay online, it often gets overridden. So how do we train it? How do we give the operator more control? Let's look at a structure that most people have never heard of, but that plays a critical role in this internal negotiation. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC for short. This region acts as a bridge between your emotion centers and your executive centers. It monitors conflict. It tracks errors. It notices when your actions don't align with your goals. And it helps you course correct. What's remarkable is that this area is highly trainable. Just like a muscle, the ACC strengthens with use. And when you train it, you literally increase your capacity to observe thought without being dominated by it, to notice emotional reactions without immediately acting on them. One of the best ways to do this is through deliberate attention training. And no, I'm not just talking about meditation, although that can help. I'm talking about controlled exposure to discomfort that requires cognitive override. A perfect example is deliberate cold exposure. When you step into a cold shower or an ice bath, your limbic system screams, "Get out. This is dangerous." But if you remain still, if you breathe deeply and stay calm, you're not just enduring, you're strengthening a direct line between your prefrontal cortex and your limbic brains. You're teaching your brain that it's safe to be uncomfortable. That impulse doesn't equal command. This is measurable. Studies using fMRI scans have shown that after regular exposure to controlled stressors like colds, the neural connection between the prefrontal cortex and emotion centers actually becomes stronger. The brain adapts. You're not just building tolerance, you're rewiring your ability to choose your response under pressure. But cold isn't the only way. You can do this with any protocol that requires presence under tension. Intense exercise, focused breathing, public speaking, fasting. The key is that you're aware of the internal signal to stop, to escape, to react. And you override it with purpose. This act, recognizing the moment of internal tension and choosing conscious control over reflexive reaction, is how you teach the operator to lead. It's how you shift authority away from the automatic and toward the intentional. And it all starts with understanding that the mind is not one thing. It's a network of systems, some ancient, some modern. Some fast, some slow. If you only try to control the machine, the outcomes, the behaviors, without training the operator, your conscious awareness and attention, then you'll always be reacting. You'll always feel behind your own thoughts. But when you understand these neural dynamics, and more importantly, when you train the system that observes the system, you gain a kind of control that most people never touch. A control rooted not in effort or discipline alone, but in precision, in deliberate, targeted self-regulation that reshapes the way your brain interprets stress, emotion, and impulse. When people feel unmotivated, distracted, or emotionally stuck, they tend to think something is wrong with their mindset or their environment. But in neuroscience, we know the real driver behind these states is often far more chemical than people realize. At the core of how we experience energy, focus, drive, and even emotional resilience is one-word neurochemistry. And unless you understand how to work with your brain's chemicals, not against them, you will always be in conflict with your own biology. Now, let's break that down. The brain is not just an electrical organ. It's a chemical organ. It uses neurotransmitters to send signals between neurons. And the ratios and timing of these neurochemicals determine your mood, your focus, your motivation, your stress levels, everything. But we're not talking about randomly increasing dopamine or serotonin, like pushing buttons on a vending machine. This is about understanding when and how these chemicals are released and how you can intentionally guide that process with precision. Let's start with dopamine. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure molecule. That's not quite right. Dopamine is actually the molecule of anticipation, pursuit, and motivation. It's what gets you up and moving toward a goal. When dopamine levels rise, your brain perceives value in the effort itself, even before the reward shows up. This is critical to understand because so many people try to control their minds by forcing discipline, when what they really need is to realign their dopamine systems. One of the most powerful ways to do that is by shifting how you reward yourself. Your brain has a reward prediction mechanism. When you complete a goal and reward yourself immediately with a treat, a scroll through social media or even self-congratulation, you condition the brain to seek external validation. But when you delay the reward, or better yet, focus on the effort itself as the source of reward, something very different happens. You teach your dopamine system to fire in response to effort, not outcome. This changes everything. You're no longer chasing results for validation. You're generating motivation from within the tasks. Neuroscience calls this intrinsic reinforcement. It activates circuits between the prefrontal cortex and the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, the primary source of dopamine in the brain. When you lean into effort and enjoy the challenge, you create a self-sustaining feedback loop of motivation. This is exactly how elite athletes, creators, and high performers keep going even when the outcomes are uncertain. And there's another player in this system, norepinephrine. This is the neurochemical associated with alertness and arousal. It's released by the locus coeruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem that acts as a spotlight, enhancing your ability to focus. When norepinephrine rises in the right amount, you become mentally locked in. But too much, and it turns into anxiety. Too little, and you fall into fatigue or boredom. So how do you regulate norepinephrine with scientific precision? One way is by controlling your visual attention. When you narrow your gaze, when your eyes are fixed on a single point, your brain activates the locus coeruleus and increases norepinephrine output. This isn't metaphorical, it's literal. Your visual system is part of your brains. It's the only part of your central nervous system that sits outside the skull. And the way you use your eyes changes your state. Narrow vision increases alertness. Wide vision, or panoramic vision, reduces stress and engages the parasympathetic nervous system. So when you need to activate focus, narrow your gaze. When you need to calm down, widen it. This is a behavioral tool you can deploy at any moment. No pills, no hacks. Just precision. Now, there's also acetylcholine, the molecule of learning and plasticity. When acetylcholine is released, it sharpens your focus even further. It marks certain neural connections for strengthening, like a highlighter on a page. You can trigger acetylcholine by leaning into tasks that require sustained concentration. The longer you remain engaged, the more this system gets activated. But here's the kicker. All of these chemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, they don't operate in isolation. They operate in concert. And what ties them together is behavior. This is where most people get it wrong. They think they need to wait until they feel motivated to act. But in reality, action precedes chemistry. Your behavior can trigger the neurochemical cascade. If you move first, the brain follows. So if you're feeling stuck, If your mind feels out of control, it's not a personal flaw. It's a chemical imbalance, often self-inflicted by habits that hijack your reward system. Endlessly scrolling, multitasking, chasing external hits of dopamine without earning them. But you can change this. You can reset your baseline levels through simple science-based behaviors. Start by removing unearned dopamine. Get off the short-term reward loop. Then redirect that energy into effort. Use your visual system to guide your state. Recognize that your brain isn't resisting you. It's just following rules it was designed to follow. Your job is to learn those rules and then use them, not to manipulate, but to master. Because when you treat neurochemistry as your ally instead of a mystery, you're not just reacting to life anymore. You're steering it from the inside out. One of the most misunderstood truths about human performance, decision making, and mental clarity is this: if your internal state is out of control, your external actions will be reactive, scattered, and often misaligned with your goals. This isn't just philosophical, it's biological. The nervous system sets the tone for everything. And if you learn how to control it deliberately, with scientific precision, you can access levels of focus, calm, and power that most people never reach. Think about the last time you made a poor decision under stress. Maybe you spoke too quickly, or pulled back from an opportunity, or couldn't think clearly in a moment that required confidence. Most people attribute that to personality or emotion or even bad luck. But what was really happening was a dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, the network that controls your heart rate, your breathing, your level of alertness, and ultimately your ability to think clearly under pressure. The autonomic nervous system has two main branches. One is the sympathetic nervous system. This is your body's accelerator. It activates fight or flight, increases alertness, mobilizes energy. The other is the parasympathetic nervous system. This is your brake. It slows you down, promotes digestion, relaxation, recovery. Both are essential, but most people live in a chronic state of low-grade sympathetic activation. They're always slightly stressed, slightly anxious, slightly on edge, even if there's no real threat present. And that background noise makes it incredibly hard to access deep focus, rational thinking, or emotional regulation. This is where state control becomes the superpower. Because when you can intentionally guide your nervous system into the right mode for the task ahead, whether that's high alert or deep calm, you unlock the full capacity of your brain and body. Let's break this down neurologically. Every time your heart beats, pressure sensors in the body send signals up through the vagus nerve into the brainstem. That's how your brain keeps track of your internal state. When your breathing is fast and shallow, when your heart rate is elevated, the brain interprets that as stress. And it starts shutting down long-range thinking in the prefrontal cortex. You go into survival mode, tunnel vision, reflex, habitual reactions. Now, in a real crisis, that's useful. But in most modern scenarios, public speaking, decision-making, creative work, this actually limits performance. So the question is, how do you get your nervous system to work for you, not against you? How do you regulate your internal state before you act? One of the most reliable and immediate tools is something called the physiological sigh. It's a pattern of breathing where you take a deep inhale through the nose, followed by a second shorter inhale, also through the nose, and then a slow, controlled exhale through the mouth. This breathing pattern triggers a rapid shift in the autonomic balance, leaning you back toward parasympathetic activation. In simple terms, it calms you down almost instantly. This isn't new age. It's measurable. Research from our lab at Stanford and others has shown that just 1 to 3 of these sighs can significantly reduce physiological markers of stress, heart rate, cortisol levels, and even blood pressure. The effect is so reliable that elite military units use this exact method before entering high-stakes environments. It works because it tells the brain through the body that the threat is over or at least manageable. And this opens up access to higher cognitive functions. The moment your heart rate slows and your breathing deepens, blood flow returns to the prefrontal cortex. You can think more clearly. You can make nuanced decisions. You can choose your response instead of defaulting to a reaction. This is what high performers across every domain do. They regulate before they act. But breath control is just the starting point. Once you've shifted your internal state, you can begin layering in other protocols that increase control. One of the most powerful is deliberate mental framings. This involves consciously naming your internal state and pairing it with intent. So instead of saying, "I'm nervous," you say, "My body is alert and preparing me to perform." This isn't just positive thinking. It's reframing the physiological signals your body sends. And that reframe alters the way your brain interprets the situation. When you do this repeatedly, you're engaging circuits in the insular cortex and anterior cingulate, areas involved in interoception, which is your brain's ability to sense what's happening inside the body. The more accurately you can read your internal state, the more precisely you can regulate it. And that, over time, builds true self-mastery. You can also leverage posture. Standing upright, shoulders back, chest open. This changes your respiratory pattern, which feeds back into your brain through the same vagus nerve. The loop is constant. What the body does, the brain notices. And what the brain notices, it adjusts for. So if you begin by shifting the body, even subtly, the mind follows. All of this points to one fundamental principle. You must intervene at the level of physiology before expecting to control behavior or thought. So trying to make a rational decision while your nervous system is in chaos is like trying to operate a computer during a power surge. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. If the system isn't stable, the performance will be poor. This is what most people never learn. They chase better thinking, more focus, or emotional discipline without addressing the platform. All of those things run on the state. And state is trainable. It's accessible, it's controllable through breath, through body, through awareness, and through deliberate behavioral tools grounded in real neuroscience. When we talk about controlling the mind, it's easy to fall into vague advice or abstract concepts. But neuroscience offers us something more powerful: precision. Real tools grounded in measurable biology that allow you to shift from being ruled by thought, impulse, and emotion to becoming the operator of your own internal systems. You now understand that your mind is not a single entity. It's a network: logic, emotion, impulse, focus, all competing for dominance. And that network can be trained. You've learned that your neurochemistry is not fixed. Motivation, drive, and attention are chemical signals that respond to how you move, where you place your focus, and how you engage with effort. You've also seen that your internal state, your nervous system, sets the tone for every action you take. And by mastering that internal state first, you create space for conscious, intentional behavior to emerge. This isn't about becoming superhuman. It's about becoming fully human with access to your entire cognitive toolkit under your own command in real time. You're not a passenger in your mind. You're the pilot, and with scientific precision, you now have the map, the instruments, and the protocols to fly it exactly where you want to go.